As the Holocaust fades into history and fewer survivors remain to tell their horrific tales, the world has begun to forget how bigotry, racism, xenophobia, stereotyping, and hatred can unleash unspeakable acts of evil. In our country today, we are witnessing the popularization of the same sorts of attitudes towards foreigners, which led so many Europeans to join the Nazi Party to eradicate Jews and other demonized groups. Agnes Bales, the lone Holocaust survivor at Temple Shalom Emeth in Burlington, Massachusetts, has agreed to tell her story as a cautionary tale so that others will understand where these feelings can lead. For me, Agnes's story is very personal. Not only did this happen to a beloved member of our community, but my family is also from Hungary. All of my grandfather's relatives in this picture were taken to concentration camps and murdered because they were Jews. 6 million of my people were killed. This can never become remote and foreign. As the philosopher George Santayana said, if we don't remember the lessons of the past, we are doomed to repeat them. Never again is now. Welcome to this special edition of Spiritually Speaking.
My mother says she was in the hospital holding me. She says, what a time to bring a baby into the world. When they started demonstrating the arrow cross, death to the Jews, death to the Jews. I remember early 40s, where the so-called Jewish laws, every day there was something new. When they pasted the paper on the walls on the street, the Jews could go on the street from this hour to that hour. They could not teach in universities, but this would change. Literally every day something new would come in. But we were still, living there. We had some family in South America, and my parents considered going there at that point. And that was too late. Jews couldn't leave the country anymore. My parents had a business on one of the nicer streets in the city, and it was questionable if they were going to let them be there because it was a Jewish business. And they let them be there for a while, and then they just shut the business down. I remember being a very happy little kid, going to the playground with my mother and going on long walks. There is a beautiful long street in Budapest, and we would go there. And then these restrictions were stronger and more strict. And I remember very clearly when the mailman rings the bell on the apartment, and my mother comes in the living room crying. And that was the letter that my father had to go into forced labor camp. This is a very vivid image in front of my eyes. My mother crying, and in a few days my father had to report. And then came another law that Jews could not live. We had a one-bedroom apartment, so it wasn't a huge, but it was a very nice apartment, and we were very comfortable there. But it was considered too big for my mother and the two, myself and George, my brother. So they were going to put somebody in, but my mother knew this lady and her mother, a Jewish lady. And my mother said to them, why don't you move in with us? Because at least we knew them. They had the yellow star on the building, so Jews were allowed to live in there. And shortly after these two ladies moved in, the arrow cross came one very early morning in the fall. It was a cold, cold morning, and all the women between a certain age, which my mother was in that bracket, had to go downstairs to report. And my mother kind of knew what it was. And I remember I was crying. I wanted to go with her. I mean, I was 5 years old. And my mother at first said, okay, just, we will put something warm on you and you can come with me. And then she changed her mind, thank God. She says, no, it's nice and warm in here. Why don't you just go back in bed? It's nice and warm in your bed. And she went downstairs to report. And that's when she never came back. But we had a little balcony with holes opening so I could look out. And I went on all fours. I crawled out on the balcony and I looked out in one of the holes and I saw the SS with guns pointed at these women, and I saw my mother being led away with the gun pointed at her. And that was the last I saw her until long after the war was over. George and I were left in the apartment with these two ladies, only because they didn't fit that age bracket. Everything was so organized that it's sickening to think back to it. A couple of days later, they came back again, the SS, and they took the other group of women who were born in that bracket. So the two ladies were taken away. Then just George and I stayed by ourselves in the apartment with really no food or anything. I don't remember being terribly scared at that point. Maybe because George was there. As long as George was there, I was okay. And then a lady from across the hall, in the building, she wasn't Jewish, she came over, she rang the bell, and she asked us if she could help, is there anything we needed. She was a very nice neighbor. And we said, no, we will be okay. And then the following day, she said that the same lady came back in, and she said, they are rounding up Jewish children too, so maybe I better take you to the Jewish orphanage. There was a Jewish orphanage in the city. So we said, okay. So she took our hands and she walked us into the Jewish orphanage, which was in a big, at one time it may have been a beautiful building, but by then it was run down and it was way overcrowded with Jewish children. We were sleeping on the floor and because I was little, I got to sleep in a crib with another little girl, which sounds good, except the little girl wet herself every night, so we just slept in it. What are you gonna do? And I stayed there, and of course George was put into another building, because boys go to another building. But there was a window on the room and I could look down, and George was helping, taking the trash out and everything. He's 5 years older. And from the window I could see George, which was, everything. And we stayed there during, I guess, Christmas, although there was nothing. It was a Jewish orphanage. But I just remember a lot of kids were waiting for, in Hungary and a lot of parts of Europe, Santa Claus is not associated with Christmas. Santa Claus has a holiday of its own. So, they were waiting for Santa Claus to bring them chocolates or something. And of course, Santa Claus never came. I cried constantly, day and night. I cried. Not a big surprise, being left alone in a overcrowded room like this, that if you had to go to the bathroom at night, you had to step over other sleeping children. I don't even remember if there was anything on the floor when we slept on the floor. Maybe a blanket, I don't remember that, but sometimes I slept in that crib, and then sometimes I slept on the floor. I knew it's not good to be Jewish, and I knew they took my parents because they were Jews. That was very clear, they made it sure we knew it, And also the orphanage, we knew that we had to behave because we were Jews. And that's how I grew up. You have to comb your hair and you have to be clean. So in school they can't say that dirty Jewish girl. We had no school, no program for the children, just hanging. And the meals, we went to some kind of in a building there was a room that had tables and chairs. And I just remember sometimes the food was really inedible. I mean, if you're hungry and you can't eat it, it was bad. And I just remember that we were hungry. We're always hungry, basically. But a lady from the building where we lived with my parents came to visit us, and she actually brought us some food. My mother gave me a hat and I don't know how you call it, we called it a muff. She told me, now you take good care of it, like a mother would tell the kid, So when we went to the orphanage, I took the hat and the muff, and they said that I can't hold on to it because it will get lost with the little girls. They gave it to one of the big girls to take care of it for me. So the time came when George and the boys were taking the trash out, and they went by the director's office, and they heard there were some Hungarian Nazis and some SS, and they were talking that all the children have to go to the Danube. And the boys, George and his friends, they knew what that meant. And they said, okay, we have to get out of here. And they went down to the fence, and they were starting to break the fence when George said, wait a minute, I have a little sister here. And his friend said, oh, don't worry about it, just come with us, she'll be okay. And George said, no, I'm going back for her. And he came back, and I couldn't find my stupid fur hat. So he had to wait for me, which never found it, so that was okay. I went without a hat, without anything. And we went back, the two of us went back where they broke the fence. Of course, all the kids were gone. So it was George and I, just the two of us. It was on a beautiful road where this orphanage was. And a few blocks down were the Nazi headquarters. So to go anywhere, we had to walk by that. So George was training me what to say if they stop us. You say that we are Catholics and our house got bombed. There was an air raid going on, by the way, while this is all happening. There is an air raid. And we are just the two kids walking on the street. So what are you going to say? Well, there is an air raid and we can't go back to the place where our parents were, and our house got bombed out, and now we're going to grandma's. And George kept training me. And what do you say if they ask this? And what are you going to say if they, he was a big boy, 9 years old or what, and he's walking with this little picture of a girl. He was afraid that I say something wrong or right. Where are we going to go? So we thought we go back to the building where we used to live. So we got there and we went to the superintendent, my father was very friendly with the superintendent. They were good to us, They said that, of course, they can't keep us. They cannot keep two Jewish kids there. But they know that we had a relative across the street who had a very sick child. The boy was maybe 20 years old, never got out of bed. That's another story how the Nazis didn't take the lady, Aunt Rose. So they superintendent told us that the ghetto just opened a couple of days ago in Budapest, and they took Aunt Rose and the boy into the ghetto. And he was going to take us to the ghetto because, Jewish kids, we belong there. So he took the two of us, George and I, and we walked into the ghetto. And I remember the shack where you had to go in and they took your name. I tell you, everything was done with such precision. They took down our names and ages, our parents' names, whatever, and we were looking for this Aunt Rose. And they knew where she was, which apartment, which building. I mean, this was a whole section of Budapest that was the ghetto. And they took us there, and then the gentleman, the superintendent, handed us over to poor Aunt Rose. She needed 2 kids, I'm sure, like a hole in the head. She had no food, and that was another wicked apartment with so many people. People were sleeping on the floor and everywhere. And every night there was an air raid, so you had to go down to the shelter. And sometimes George didn't want to get up. He was I'm not going. And I did whatever Aunt Rose told me. I was a little girl, But George gave her a hard time, and I felt sorry for Aunt Rose that she had to put up with George. Then one night, again, air raid, we have to go down. George is giving Aunt Rose a hard time. He doesn't want to go. And Aunt Rose, I don't know, she got very stern with him. You just have to come with us. Thank God for that, because that night the building got bombed. The whole building disappeared over us. We survived in a shelter. Before that, Aunt Rose used to go up to the apartment to cook a soup or something. That was all over. No more upstairs at all. And there were some people who didn't come to the shelter, and they got injured, and they brought them in the shelter, and I just heard the people dying. It was horrible. And in the morning they said, oh, this and this and this died overnight, and there was no place to bury them. There was a big park, and they just took these people there and they just piled them up like logs. But we survived. George and the boys went and they broke the walls between the shelters, so they had the run of the ghetto underground. And I'm sure George was one of the youngest. There were older boys too, but not much, because the older ones were already taken to concentration camps. But anyway, they could go around, and they went into like a grocery store that had to close down, and they had some leftover flour, or they had some, and this I remember, George got some tomato soup in some kind of a dish, and he brought it so happily and gave it to me, and there was mold floating on top, and I wouldn't eat it. I said, no, I don't want it. And Aunt Rose just did, just push it over and eat it. And she went like this, just push it over and eat it. Well, I did, and I ate it, and I survived. And George got me toys. They broke into where they had a toy store or something. So he brought me toys. I remember he got me little chickens that were like spritzing, supposedly cologne or something. So he brought me some of these little chickens, and he brought me toys. I mean, talking about living in a ghetto, in a shelter, and I got new toys, So we were in the ghetto for a long time. This was early in the winter, and the Russians didn't come in until late in the spring. we were liberated by Russian forces, which was good because we could get out of from underground, but it wasn't very good in many ways. But at that time it was wonderful. We could try to go back to Aunt Rosa's house and see, if anything was there. We had to walk by this park where all the dead bodies were stored. And Aunt Rose just took my head and pushed it against her skirt so I wouldn't see it. Of course, I saw it by then. She says, "Don't look there, don't look there." But of course, I saw it by then. And we got back to her apartment. And it went on. There was no food, there was no way to heat up the apartment. We were freezing. But somehow she took care of me. I think George suffered more than I did because, he had to go out, and these boys went into the bombed out buildings and they collected wood from, the girders and everything and brought it back, and there was a stove in the kitchen, and Aunt Rose was able to cook on it with this wood that the boys brought in. Came the summertime, and my uncle already came back from concentration camp. He lived in a country town, and they shipped us there because in the country there was food. In Budapest there was no food. So Aunt Rose sent us there. And it was good there. There was milk, and there were chickens running around the yard. It was, and we thought we were in heaven there. And my uncle, he was friendly with the Russians. He made friends with some of the higher, whatever you call them, Russians. And I remember Sundays he used to have a lunch for these Russian soldiers and the Russians who were overseeing the town. And it was like it felt like I never seen food like that. They had sour cream, they had milk, they had pasta, whatever. And so obviously the Russians liked him a lot. And then a word came from Budapest that my mother has arrived and she's at Aunt Rose's, so we should go back. And there was a lady, I don't know who she was, a relative or friend or what, and she said that she'll take us on a train. So the three of us, the lady and George and I, got on the train, and the train was of course overcrowded. We were sitting on our bundles on the floor, and a Russian came with a gun, and he started yelling. We didn't understand, we had no idea what he was saying, so everybody quickly got off the train. And then nothing happened, so we just got back on the train. What are you gonna do? And we arrived in Budapest like that. And we went to, my mother was at Aunt Rose's apartment, so we went there. This lady took us there. And we went in, and I saw somebody standing in the hallway. I didn't know who it was. Turned out that was my mother. And I didn't recognize her. I mean, she went through concentration camp, and she came home on the top of the train. She traveled on top of the train, so she was sunburned, and she was skinny as can be. I'm sure she didn't look very good. And she actually came up to me and she gave me a hug. And then I recognized her voice, and slowly it came back to me, that's my mother. And I remember the three of us, George and my mother and I, went in Aunt Rosa's living room, sat on the sofa, and my mother put her arms around the two of us, and she says, and this is for sure, she said, now we are going to forget about this like it never happened. And of course you can't do that, but that was her wishful thinking, you know. And we had no place to go, so all of us stayed now at Aunt Rosa's house. And she started to try to get our apartment back, but that was very difficult because somebody already moved in. So my mother had to join the Communist Party to have some clout to try to get the apartment back. And eventually she did, and we went back to our apartment. A lot of things were missing, needless to say. And there was no heat, our apartment was a very modern, very nice apartment. It was central heating, central hot water before the war. After the war there was no heat, no hot water. So my mother went out, and for her engagement ring, she got us a little stove that you could burn anything in it, paper, wood, coal, whatever. I don't know what is it called, but I remember it was a little green stove. So she put that in what was the living room at one time, and we all slept there, and she was able to cook something on top of this little stove. And I went with her when she got it, and it was her ring that they got us. You know, I mean, it was a shame for the ring, but the ring doesn't keep you warm, doesn't cook you food. So then we stayed in that one room. And eventually, you know, things started to change. I think after the war, when I was already back in school, so things were somewhat settling in. 2 men came to our apartment, and my mother sent me out of the room, which happened very seldom. She sent me out of the room that she wanted to talk to these 2 men. And when the men left, my mother was crying uncontrollably. So I just had a feeling they had some news about my father. I could never ask my mother. I could never get myself to ask her, because I knew how painful it was to her. Supposedly he was in Bor. That's Germany, I think, B-O-R. I actually found his name in Israel. You know, you can check it online. The people who disappeared during the Holocaust. And his name is listed there with the correct date when he was born. So I know for sure it's him.
Thanks so much for listening. May Agnes's story serve as a warning that we must forever be on guard to keep our evil impulses, those of our society and our leaders, in check. Silence and complacency are not an option. Shalom, salam, shanti, peace.